Zuma is not done. In South Africa, liberalism got married to racism. Cyril Ramaphosa undoubtedly is the de jure president of the Republic. But is he the de facto president of the Republic? People like Mbalula read the statement of intent.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today I'm really glad to once again be joined by SMWX legend and political analyst of the highest order, uGogo Aubrey Matshiqi. Gogo, thank you for joining us. I think we can call this the third in a trilogy of conversations that have happened around this election.
Well, because we are in the age of the government of national unity, I will greet you in more than one language. Tamaku,
Tamako.
namaste,
Namaste.
shalom, salam alaikum, tawans.
Togozan Gogo. We are in the age of unity. All our problems have been swept aside.
Yes.
And so there's nothing more to talk about. But
Yes.
here we are. And let's begin, Gogo, with a question I have for you. To what extent does this government of national unity, quote unquote, which is not a government of national unity, represent a betrayal of the liberation struggle? You tweeted in your usual figurative way that this was the biggest betrayal since 1562, or 1652, sorry. What did you mean by that, and to what extent do you think this moment constitutes a betrayal?
Well, let me start by going back to what the liberation struggle was about and what it was not about. The liberation struggle was about the creation of a society that would be the antithesis of apartheid society. But the achievement of a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society was not the ultimate goal. Because upon achieving the goal, or the goal of creating a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society, the task begins of achieving another goal. The goal of setting up a society that is the antithesis of the society I've succeeded in creating, that is the society that is at that point the antithesis of apartheid society. Now, that's going to be an ongoing task for a very long time. Last time we spoke about the fact that history is a ceaseless repetition of error, folly, and correction. In the course of the struggles to create such a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society, and in the course of engaging in struggles of creating a society that is the antithesis of even that society, you have achieved in creating a society that is the antithesis of apartheid society. There will be moments of error. There will be moments of folly. And there will be moments of correction. I think right now, this moment is a moment of error and folly. So the GNU moment is a moment of error and folly. What must follow, therefore, is the struggle for the correction of this error and folly. Now, how many ballot papers did you get when you voted?
3.
Me too. both of us did not get the fourth one. Because the fourth one, and I say the fourth one because those who talk in defense of this era and folly we call the GNU say that voters decided that they want a coalition. No party will govern alone. In fact, some in the ANC have even argued that voters decided they want the ANC and the DA to govern together. Of course, if you look at what the ANC garnered, under 40%, but let's be generous and say 40%, and arithmetically round it off to 40%. So 60% of voters did not vote for the ANC. Let's round off what the GA got and say it's 22%. So 78% of voters did not vote for the DA. So what were they voting for? When 78% of voters did not vote for the DA and 60% did not vote for the ANC, if we look at the two cumulatively, it cannot be that those who voted, who constitute a minority in more than one way, it cannot be that what they were doing, where they were dictating into existence a government of national unity or a coalition. I say they're a minority in more than one way because a third of voters who qualified to vote did not vote. So the participation rate was as low in this election as it was in the 2021 election, if it wasn't lower. So actually, if we look at this in terms of the participation rate, it is a minority that wills this GNU into existence, if, of course, you buy the fairy tales that politicians have been telling us about the GNU. And that brings us, of course, to the question of language. Here I'm guided by the work of the Indian philosopher, J. Krishnamurti, who, amongst other things, says, words are not what they describe. The word flower is not a flower. Therefore, the words government of national unity are not a government of national unity. The words social justice are not social justice. The word democracy is not democracy. And if that is the case, the task, therefore, is to bridge the gap between what words describe and the reality they seek to describe.
Can I ask you, Gogo, on
Yes.
that? Why do you think there's such a stampede to call this coalition a government of national unity when it clearly is not one? And what do you think, what is the work of this phrase doing? What is it revealing and what is it concealing that we as a citizenry need to be aware of? And in addition to that, I can understand when politicians want to use terms in ways that, shall we say, stretch their meaning to the limits of absurdity. But I have less sympathy for media, and here I talk both about the public broadcaster, I'm afraid, and commercial media, News 24, etc., who latch on to the words that politicians have chosen and are not giving people a critical sensibility and are using this GNU term as if it's a fact when it is at best an opinion.
Yes. Well, in our last conversation, we referred, albeit fleetingly, to this problem of
Little
flooding.
did we know.
Yes, exactly. Now, we've been here before. This government of national unity and the language and the words that are being used to mislead us are reminiscent of a moment in our history that is not dissimilar in terms of its meaning and import. This is when Nelson Mandela decides he's going to wear the number 6 Springbok jersey. It's the same logic. When the Springbok, to me, is not just a symbol of apartheid. It is actually a symbol of apartheid denial. It is a symbol of apartheid denial now. It was a symbol of apartheid denial at the time of the Rugby World Cup in 1995. Was it 1995? Yes. So Nelson Mandela wears the number 6 Springbok jersey to legitimize, inadvertently or otherwise, consciously or unconsciously. In other words, he becomes either a conscious or unconscious agent of apartheid denial when he wears that jersey. Now remember, that moment follows the moment of the 1994, the year before, Government of National Unity.
Sure. And it happens within that government of national unity.
Yes. And even there, the country is sold this fairy tale of unity, a rainbow nation. I saw yesterday as we had the fly past by the toys of the South African National Defence Force, of the South African Air Force. The commentator was quite animated and excited, and in his excitement, he refers to the rainbow nation. So the fairy tale of a rainbow nation, remember, is an imposition that gives birth to another imposition. If you are a rainbow nation, if you truly support the idea of a rainbow nation, you can't oppose the idea of a government of national unity. And in 1994, how do you express your support of the idea of a government of national unity? Is firstly by supporting this fiction, this fairy tale of a rainbow nation. Upon legitimizing that fairy tale, you can then legitimize another fairy tale, the fairy tale of a government of national unity. Now, I will put it in the different languages of my ancestors and tell you what this government of national unity is. My Tswana and Sotho ancestors would say, Kisipuko, Sansinzi. My Zulu ancestors would say, Isipogi, Sempugani. My white ancestors will say, this is the ghost of a fly. Now, there's a spider web in front of you, and a fly gets caught in that spider web. The spider comes and eats the insides of the fly. So there's nothing inside. But if you come after that moment, what you will see is a fly. And in your mind, the fly is intact, when actually what you're looking at is the ghost of a fly. Sipuku sansins, isipogi sempuga. That's what the GNU is. It is the ghost of a fly. The insides have been eaten by the spider. That's what it is.
Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode. Ispoki sembukani, madoda.
Yes.
Wow, wow, wow. It's so true. And it feels like, we've been here before in 94, but I feel we've also been here before with the New Dawn narrative.
Yes.
And I think there's a deeper conversation as a nation we need to have with ourselves about why we are so addicted to these sugar rush moments of false hope.
Yes.
I'm not against hope. In fact, I think it's one of the most profound virtues. But for me, hope should come when you see people who live in poverty brought out of poverty, or racialized inequality being dealt a serious blow, or unemployment changing direction, people getting housing and healthcare. But we seem every 5 years or 10 years or so to, as a nation, wish for this moment of short-term hope to see us through before there's any evidence for that hope. And I really wonder what it is about our national psyche that needs these moments of superficial unity when our society is so structurally divided.
Well, we are slaves to the no. And what is required is for us to free ourselves from the no. What is the no? Those of us who were victims of colonialism and apartheid, the known is the pain of the past. But those of us who were victims of colonialism and apartheid, the known is something else. The known is the liberation movement. In this case, the known is the ANC. And that is why for too long, over the past 30 years, we could not imagine our future with or without the ANC. In fact, for too long, we could not imagine our future without the ANC. Even the perpetrators of apartheid colonialism, or those who benefited from it, who are now going to sit with us in the government of national unity, even them could not conceive of our future without the ANC. Another known is that of the Rainbow Nation. Because when you are not free from the known, you become a slave to attachment. You become attached and therefore become a slave to ideas. I'll give you an example. A country is a story. Countries are stories. Countries are works of fiction. Countries are fairy tales. So South Africa is a story. South Africa is a fairy tale. In terms of the fairy tale, in terms of the story, South Africa is a place where South Africa belongs to all who live in it. A fairy tale. The reality is that South Africa belongs to those who captured it. But we have become so attached to this fairy tale of what South Africa is. We've even become so attached to this story that we fail to heed the warning made by Chimamanda Ngozi when she warns against the dangers of a single story. So the fairy tale or the story of this GNU, this work of fiction, is the success that has been achieved in imposing a single story, a story of what South Africa is, when in fact this story is a work of fiction. So this GNU is also the product or is a function of something else, a manufactured consent. Now, what forces are responsible for manufacturing this this consent? Amongst others, the media has become an instrument when it comes to manufacturing consent in this country. And even when it comes to this fiction we call the GNU, the media has been complicit in manufacturing consent. Too many in our media are people who, when those in power tell them the sky is blue, they don't check for themselves. They take it for granted that the sky is blue. But that is a function of something else. Remember that news is not valueless. News is value-laden because this thing we call news is socially constructed. So when we look at the narrative of the Government of National Unity over the past few weeks, if we were talking about the literary text, as part of our analytical framework, we would have to deploy the idea of the intertextuality of a text. What gives this text meaning? One of the things that gives a text meaning is what the reader brings to it. Another thing is, who is the reader? Whose voice is the authorial voice, for instance?
And who is the author thinking that they're
Yes.
writing to as well?
Exactly. So all those elements and more give meaning. And this is what has happened here with the GNU, if we're going to use the analogy of a literary text. And then, of course, there's this question of who knows? Who says who knows? Who tells us who knows? Who tells us what knowledge is? And these questions arise because this fiction comes into being and takes root because something else has happened. To impose this kind of fiction, you must impose something else, what I call a canon of rational opinion. So anything that is critical of the GNU, and this is what we are doing, is therefore deemed irrational because it is inconsistent with this imposed canon of rational opinion. And that is why, if you are critical of the GNU, you are backward, you are immature, you are not educated, and all the phrases that have been used to describe those who are critical of the GNU.
You also have some kind of hidden political agenda, which is tied to either the EFF, MK, or somehow both as well.
Exactly. Therefore, if you are critical of the GNU, you are of the same ilk as MK and the EFF, to the extent that in our discourse, there's an extent to which the EFF and MK are nothing but media or mediums through which we propagate our prejudices.
Gogo, before we move on to the sitting in Parliament and the cabinet and questions about where to from here and some of the contradictions we've seen between partners in this coalition. There's one other just deeper question I want to touch on as you speak, which comes to mind, and it's a fear of mine as you say that, which is that the space for critical thought is in danger of shrinking in this moment of imposed and superficial, quote, unity. Because at the very least, say what you like about the DA, they formed and they played a role of opposition to the ANC.
Yes.
Sometimes they did it well and sometimes they did it not so well. But there was a certain form of critical voice in opposition to ANC dominance. Now, when we add the two voices together, and I see this when DA influencers are now singing from the same hymn sheet as ANC spin doctors. The space for the voices have just diminished now. I think we're virtually on our own now, Gogo, because even the critical DA voices have now left. And the media is on board. So there's a very small space for critical media conversation. And democracy is about critical reflection. Because if it's only about just singing the praises of the government all day, then what are we even here for? So I fear that space of critical reflection might shrink significantly in this so-called national unity moment. And if ever we have needed critical reflection, it's now when these powerful forces have united.
Well, the voice of the DA, this critical voice of the DA, in part is shaped by things that are not unproblematic. For instance, the DA is an embodiment of the settler colonial paternalistic mindset. And therefore, some of its criticism emanates from the settler colonial paternalistic mindset, particularly that of the English-speaking settler. So even when it is critical to the power of the ANC, and I have been critical of this idea of speaking truth to power, in the sense that we speak partial truth to power, in this sense. We don't speak truth to all forms of power. We speak truth only to certain forms of power. We don't speak truth to forms of power that benefit us. And so to the extent that the DA was critical of the ANC, was a critical voice, it spoke truth to a particular form of power. It did not speak truth to all forms of power. And that is why, for instance, Helen Zille will say things like colonialism did us a favor, did black people a favor. And it is in that context, for instance, that these reprehensible videos have emerged of a DA member of parliament who spews the most racist of things. I have argued over the years that racism is a dynamic that is internal to, not external to the DA. The DA is an embodiment of the settler colonialist, paternalistic mindset. People have forgotten that even people like Helen Zille, as part of liberalism in this country, were not in favor of one person, one vote at some point. Remember that the Liberal Party the precursor of what we call the DA today, the precursor of the Progressive Federal Party, the precursor of the Democratic Party, which is the precursor of the Democratic Alliance, was not in favor of one person, one vote. They were in favor of what they called the qualified franchise. Only certain classes or groups of black people should vote, not all of them. Those who have attained a certain level of education, those who have land and things like that. Those, according to this liberal logic, could vote. Now, remember something else about the DA. So the idea that the DA is a party of liberalism is a misnomer. Elsewhere in the world, you would call the DA what it is, a conservative party. The DA is a bastion of conservatism in South Africa. Of course, in South Africa, liberalism got married to racism. So the face of liberalism in South Africa was also the face of racism, a racist face. And therefore, it can be argued legitimately that part of the many faces of the DA is that of racism.
Well, you mentioned the Ronaldohos scandal, the shocking racist comments, which, by the way, have been public for a very long time. And I've been the recipient of lots of his abuse down the years.
As they say, by their friends, ye shall know them.
Indeed.
I don't receive those views.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't have such friends.
exactly. But it's a really important moment, and I want to focus on a few aspects of it. Number one is that before the most obviously racist videos where he's spewing these the K word and the N word and calling for the murder of black people, there are clearly racist comments, but DA leaders want to sweep them under the carpet or explain them or delay any form of accountability, wait for further verification, etc. Which means that there is this ridiculously high bar for racism where unless you say something like what Ronaldohos actually said in the video, and he did say those things, as the DA has admitted, only then in the country with the most racist history in the world can you be actually condemned and face accountability for your racism. And
sorry to interrupt.
No, by all means.
If you call for the scrapping of the Constitution, you are the devil incarnate. Worse than this whole shape. And we get here in part, to go back to an earlier question you asked about how we get here. We must problematize the positionality of the black elites or African elites. If you look at the history of colonialism, who colluded with the slave traders on the continent? Was it not the black elites, called by us kings, chiefs, and things like that? So this theme of betrayal is not new. It is one of the things the black elites have been doing for centuries, colluding with the slave traders. Going back to my Tswana and Sotho ancestors, I suppose then we can say Sitlhare of the black elites, ke Lekgowa. The medicine of the black elites is a white person. Because the black elites are so desperate for white approval. And one of the things that makes us make this choice to create a GNU and this fiction of a rainbow nation and all of that, is our desperation for white approval and the approval of global and domestic whiteness. So you saw what happened to the rand this week.
Having the time of its life.
Exactly. Now, let's call all the markets what they are. That is whiteness, right there. Whiteness as an ideology, whiteness as a dominant reality, social, politically, and economic, whiteness as a logic. So one of the problems I've had with the black elites in history and in recent times is how, through organizations like the ANC and others on the continent, the black elites have become allies of colonialism. That's one of the reasons we get here. We get here because Sitlari of the black elites, Kilikhoa, who are desperate for white approval at a global and domestic level.
And one of the manifestations of that, thinking about Ronaldohos, is that this is the GNU's MP, by the way. It's not just the DA's MP. It's also the ANC government's GNU partner now. And I've been fascinated by how quiet the ANC has been on this. And this is one of the unintended consequences of going into this coalition for the ANC that they will soon realize. Same for the DA, because I think there are going to be some interesting ANC mistakes along the way that the DA will also have to own. But what do they say to this? I mean, what does the ANC do about this? Clearly, there's an extremely racist voice, which is probably symptomatic of a much deeper and more widespread problem, which is just better hidden than Ronaldohos could hide it. But the ANC has allied itself now with some of these forces, and there's no way to naysay that they have now they've allied themselves with a lot of different forces, but one of them is voices like Ronaldohos's, which everyone knows are in the DA.
I think I must correct you, though. We must not be unkind to the ANC. I've spoken about how the black elites are desperate for white approval. I, too, would keep quiet about these racist videos of this host chap if I had just become part of Helen Zille's kitchen cabinet.
You're not holding back today, Gogo.
So the silence of the ANC when it comes to the political economy of race and the race in general.
Absolutely.
I wish I could say it's uncharacteristic. It's not uncharacteristic. Yeah.
When that is the voice that we so desperately need, it just goes missing all the time.
I asked last time, what is African about the African National Congress? In the same way that if you look at, let's say, at our universities in this country are not African universities. They are universities in Africa. The two are not the same. So the ANC is an organization in Africa, but not an African organization. So I ask again, what is African about the African National Congress?
I might ask as myself, where's the national unity and the government of national unity? But let me not belabor the point. Gogo, let's look at some of the events through which we can understand what's happening in South Africa today and South African politics. And let's come to the parliamentary sitting where the president was elected as predicted on this channel. This channel has quite the track record of predictions and beards being retained and
Yes,
all of
exactly.
that.
And lost.
Indeed. Some lost their beards, others didn't, but we won't mention any names.
So
Oratile.
Xhosa lost an opportunity because he lived before this time. Then the seminal poem would not have been Paradise Lost. It would have been A Beard Lost.
Indeed. And Yeats would have written Beards Fall Apart.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah, so the parliamentary sitting, while we're all watching the sitting, and we were lucky enough to be at the Cape Town International Convention Center, by the way, just also the symbol of that sitting being in a Cape Town Convention Center and a private building, because our parliament is burned down. We haven't even begun
Well,
to.
it was apt. It was opposite.
Yeah.
Because Cape Town is the passion of whiteness.
Yeah, and the privatization agenda, I think in some ways was symbolized by the fact that Parliament itself had to sit in a private venue.
And I must add, because I know someone is going to say, I'm not talking about the white skin. I'm talking about whiteness as a logic, as an ideology, as a worldview. And some of the purveyors of whiteness, as we see with the GNU, are not white.
Absolutely. So we're sitting and we're watching the parliamentary sitting unfolding, and then it breaks from various media channels and journalists that the ANC and the DA have found a deal. And soon after that, we see ANC and the DA collaborating very effectively, not just in Parliament, where they elect a speaker and a deputy speaker, but in KZN, where they elect a speaker, Premier, Gauteng. And it becomes clear that this ANC-DA plus coalition is in charge. What did you make, and what do you make of that moment that we saw in Parliament?
Well, I think one of the reasons some people are upset about the GNU is something born out of another misnomer. People criticize the ANC out of the mistaken belief that the ANC and the DA are different. The GNU is born out of the fact that the ANC and the DA are not different. They are similar. And so they do another with the material benefits that will come with it for those who are part of the GNU, is born precisely out of the fact that the ANC and the DA are not different. And I suppose this is why the SACP and COSATU are upset. It's because they're in denial about the true nature and character of the ANC. And what that denial has done, it has made them believe that the ANC and the DA are different, and that's why they're upset. They're upset because they think the ANC is going against its nature, whereas this is consistent with its nature and character.
Different packaging of the same ultimate ideas and agendas.
Exactly. So what is interesting for me here, after watching the inauguration yesterday, is a question I have. Cyril Ramaphosa undoubtedly is the de jure president of the Republic. But is he the de facto president of the Republic? I don't know what your answer is. Let me add something else. I suspect that what the DA may want to do, or may do, is to set up a shadow president's office within the DA. It does not necessarily follow that John Steenhuisen will head that unit as the shadow president. Back to my question. Is Cyril Ramaphosa the de facto president of the Republic? If the answer is no, who is the de facto president of the Republic?
Who do you think is the de facto president, or could be?
I'll give you multiple choice. Nkosi, John Steenhuisen, I won't make it too complicated. I will limit it to these names. Helen Zille.
It's interesting that you mention Helen Zille, President Zille, as a key force in South African politics. There's no doubt about that. We spoke, what, a year, 2 years ago?
Last year.
Yeah, where we already spoke about this potentiality. Now, we saw some very interesting contradictions emerging on live TV. And I must give a shout out to Clement Manyatela, who delivered very effective interviews with both Figile Mbalula on the SABC and Helen Zille. And after the euphoria in many quarters, that this coalition had come together and an agreement had been signed, the cracks have begun to emerge. And on the one hand, you had Mbalula as SG of the ANC saying, no, there's no veto that the DA can exercise over our decisions. And then you had Helen Zille, who, by the way, had the document right there in front of her, and quoted chapter and verse, effectively showing that there is a mutual veto.
Yes.
The ANC can't move without the DA, and similarly, the DA can't move without the ANC. But together, that force is sufficient to create consensus if there is disagreement in the coalition.
Yeah.
What did you make of that contradiction, but also the nature of this document, and how do you read it?
I have a disturbing question which haunted me the whole night last night. Did people like Mbalula read the statement of intent?
Sure.
I wonder. Because if you look at the idea of a sufficient manufactured consensus, the DA smuggled the idea of a threshold. I think it's 60%.
Which just happens to be the DA plus ANC.
Yes, but it's something else. That 60%, can it not be re-engineered to include elements of the Dubula Inyanga coalition? So you're right. There's a mutual veto here. But
You're saying we have a government of Dubula Inyanga?
Dubula Inyanga. You must say it properly.
Yeah.
In Fanagalo, the language that Steenhuisen speaks. In Zulu, it's Dubula Inyanga. In the language Fanagalo that John Steenhuisen speaks, it's Dubula Inyanga. So this is the Dubula Inyanga coalition.
The DIC, not the GNU.
Yes, the DIC.
So back to the veto. I mean, what do you think is the significance of that? I spoke to Pierre De Vos on the channel, who said he was quite surprised that the two parties had bound themselves so inextricably. And it seems only to be dawning on the ANC and ANC supporters now that, this is really what the document does.
Well, maybe there's a question that comes before that. So I'll answer your question with my own. Is the statement of intent binding? And what does that mean?
I don't. It's not legally binding.
Yes.
So the DA couldn't, in my view, take it to court and say, well, you signed here and therefore you're politically bound to this decision. Yeah. But I think it is politically binding to the extent that the DA only signed that document in the knowledge that the sufficient consensus clause was included. And when I listen to the very interesting recent statements from Helen Zille, she's done a few interviews actually in the last few days. And I read the tea leaves of the important voices in the DA who are speaking publicly. It seems clear to me that they will pull out of this arrangement if the ANC tries to exert too much power and pretends that it is the majority party.
Pretends it has power.
Exactly. And so the legally binding nature of it is not as important to me as the politically binding nature. And I think it is politically binding within maybe a few degrees of flexibility.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think the ANC has more to lose and the DA has more to gain if the ANC violates the spirit and letter of the statement of intent. The DA, you're right, will walk away. And I think the ANC needs the DA more than the DA needs the ANC here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Except that in our last conversation, we spoke about strategy. And I said all strategies have the same weakness. They assume that the strategy is as rational as those who designed it. There is another weakness that almost all strategies have. The element of risk management is quite weak in almost every strategy. If we're talking about soccer, strategies are good going forward, very bad in defense. So I am not sure that the ANC and the DA have done enough of a risk analysis and have a risk management plan in place to mitigate the risks that may come with this coalition for them in 2026 and 2029.
I think that's true. And it goes back to this idea that just because they have 60% of the vote together doesn't mean that 60% of the country wants this outcome.
Exactly.
And I think what they haven't factored in is that any mistake is going to be met with not just public backlash, but a majority of people being against that kind of mistake. So we look at the Ronaldohos thing, which I've said the ANC is now going to have to live with DA racism and negotiate around it. And we know that just as the DA has a blind spot on its racism and racial statements, the ANC has many blind spots, particularly around accountability, around questions of the abuse of state resources and corruption. And there's no doubt in my mind, don't worry about Phala Phala and all these past state capture things. There will be new corruption scandals. There will be new evidence of taking the people's resources for granted. And I will be fascinated to see what the DA does, never mind with the old scandals, but with the new scandals. Will they also remain mute? Or will they walk away? Because those are really the two options.
Yeah, there's an extent to which a coalition of this nature is like getting married in community of property. Your assets are my assets. Your debts are my debts. Your racism is my racism. Your good governance is my good governance. Your lapses in good governance are my lapses in good governance. So both parties must understand that to some extent they are married in community of property. And Phala Phala is going to test that sooner than we think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was very interested again to hear the statements on Phala Phala because first Zille was asked on one day, have you thought about Phala Phala? And she said, we need to separate impeachment from a motion of no confidence, impeachment being the more serious attempt to remove a president from office. She didn't touch on impeachment, but she said we would defend the president that we voted for in a motion of no confidence. Then the next day, she walked that back and she said, no, if new evidence emerges, we are not bound. We will vote in the same way as we voted before, which was for a further impeachment inquiry. John Steenhuisen was then asked at the inauguration the same question, and I'm very glad that journalists keep asking about this. And he said a similar thing. If evidence emerged, by the way, this is based on the fact that no evidence has emerged. I think we have...
Or the hope that
Yeah,
no evidence will ever emerge.
exactly. So there's already a contradiction there because
The evidence is hidden in a couch.
exactly, and the DA has spoken on what they think about that evidence before.
Yeah.
But again, he said, no, if the evidence emerged, we will be under no obligation to protect the president effectively. And Nkosi Hlabisa said the same thing. So it does seem to me that these opposition parties are going into this with their eyes open and they haven't made a choice, which I think is very dangerous unless they've made a secret choice. They don't know exactly what they're going to do on this Phala issue. And imagine, quote, evidence does emerge, new evidence does emerge, or a law enforcement agency is forced to say, well, we think there's enough evidence of criminality here to begin a trial. What then? I don't know that anyone knows what to do then in this
I
coalition.
suspect that the IFP has less to worry about when it comes to mitigating risk and risk management strategies than the ANC and the DA. And I suspect the ANC has more to worry about than the DA. But there's a point we've been missing. It is not entirely true that what South Africans have been yearning for is an alternative to the ANC. South Africans have been yearning for an alternative to both the ANC and the DA. And when they do their risk analysis, both parties must bear that in mind, that there is a hunger in this country for an alternative to both of them.
And actually, the two together are roughly the same size as the ANC used to be.
Exactly.
So my hope for this moment actually is exactly that the choice before South Africans will clarify, like Helen Zille likes to say. She thinks the choice is between the EFF and MK and the DA. I think the choice is between the ANC and the DA and what the alternative is to that.
To both, yeah.
And we haven't yet imagined what that alternative looks like in full detail, but I think that's very much what this moment calls for. And once that alternative emerges, if it can emerge, I think we will be in a real moment of hope, because that alternative will be an alternative not just to one party, but to the status quo itself.
And there are many who voted for the MK party who may be of the view that the MK party constitutes an alternative to the ANC, the DA, and the EFF combined. The question the MK party must ask itself is whether, in what it has done since the election and in what it has said so far, whether it has positioned itself as such an alternative.
I worry that this constant focus on electoral disputes is really distracting the party from the much bigger priority of getting onto substantive issues. And I agree. You advised the party before, and as you advised all the parties in our previous episode, they don't have a very big window, but they have a window to really make use of this moment of uncertainty to set up an alternative. And I hope it's not squandered.
Yeah. Put differently, they must ask the question, what is the content of our path to power? And you're right, they are being terribly distracted by this argument that the election was rigged. I must be honest, I'm agnostic on whether the election was rigged or not from the perspective of MK. Because what MK must think about are the following. Firstly, there's a difference between what you know and what you can prove. The question here is, what do they know? What they know, is it the same as what they can prove? Because if what they know is something they cannot prove, then they're dabbling in fiction. and they will come out of this with egg on their faces, assuming they care. Maybe they don't.
The country's in desperate need of some kind of opposition. And we have the opposition that we have now. And again, I'm not convinced that the decision not to attend Parliament based on these electoral disputes was a good one, because ultimately the opposition now needs to take up its role and play its cards effectively. Because what we also don't want is a crisis in the coalition and a crisis in the opposition at the same time, because then we're really heading towards a worrying and a dangerous moment.
Well, what the MK party must remember is that one of the functions of an organization is to manage both the strengths and the weaknesses of the leader. And what that means is that if they do it successfully, they will not reach a stage where the delusions of the leader become properly aligned with the delusions of the rank and file. Because when that happens, then the party is toast. So it worries me that it seems there's only one strategic center in the MK party, Jacob Zuma. That is one of the weaknesses of the MK party, because it means the MK party lacks the capacity as a result to manage the strengths and the weaknesses of its leader, which means they run the risk of the day coming when the delusions of the leader become the delusions of the party. And as a result, the party will be toast.
You were saying before this interview started that President Jacob Zuma is not done.
Yeah, that's my next T-shirt. Zuma is not done. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this moment is part of a bigger moment that I call the Zuma moment. We entered the Zuma moment more or less around June 2005. And I think the Zuma moment will be with us long after Zuma himself is no longer with us. So I spoke about how since 1994, the ANC has aided and abetted counter-revolution. And in our last conversation, I argued that one of the byproducts of this counter-revolution may be the MK party. So the Zuma moment is a moment that is constitutive of other moments, including the formation of MK and what will happen because of the formation of MK. All of that is part of the Zuma moment. But the impact of the Zuma moment is going to be with us long after he is gone. Right now, the Zuma train is still on the tracks. So Zuma is not done. I don't think the Zuma moment is done. There's still more coming as far as that moment is concerned to shape the future direction of the Zuma moment and its impact on the country.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. At the same time as it's important to be critical of MK and all parties, there has been this constant narrative surrounding MK that they are 2 seconds away from plunging the country into violence, that they have some kind of violent intent that is secret and will be revealed at the appropriate moment. And the election results came Well, actually, a series of court cases came, and
Yeah.
we didn't see that.
Yeah.
Zuma was disqualified from standing in Parliament. We didn't see that. The election results came; they didn't like them, but we didn't see violence. Then people said, if and when they lose the premiership of KZN, that's the moment. Do we need to inquire into this narrative of inevitable MK violence, and in what ways is this preventing us from actually dispassionately trying to understand what the political phenomenon that lies underneath MK is?
We need to problematize this narrative. In a way, we did not with another narrative. We were very uncritical about the imposition of the narrative of state capture. And when actually what happened there is that the narrative of state capture was not a narrative born out of our antipathy towards state capture. We don't have an in-principle opposition to state capture. We are opposed to state capture only to the extent that at certain moments the state is captured by those who are not like us, who do not like us. But when the state is captured by those who are like us, who like us, and who we like, we have no problem with state capture. And anyway, that narrative of state capture was ahistorical in the sense that the post-apartheid state was captured before, not after 1994. So by the time this thing we called state capture happened, the post-apartheid state had been captured before 1994. We have no problem with the state being captured by certain forces. White capital, for instance. But Bell Pottinger did those who are uncritical or dishonest about the true nature of state capture a favor, because he could use Bell Pottinger to discredit in its entirety any attempt at the emergence of a counter-hegemonic discourse on the question of state capture. We must not make the same mistake this time. We must problematize and interrogate this narrative that the MK party is an epitome of violence. Now that comes out of something else, another fiction. This idea that liberal democracy and our constitutionalism constitute the zeitgeist of our post-apartheid reality. Linked to that fiction is another fiction when you listen to the narrative of the GNU. It is the fiction that we have now entered a post-racial period in the history of this country. Another fiction. But back to the violence. Violence will happen. I don't know whether it's going to happen in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. But the conditions of underdevelopment that still plague those who were victims of colonialism and apartheid colonialism inevitably will produce violence. Something else will produce violence. I say to you that South Africa does not belong to all who live in it. That's an aspiration we have not achieved yet. South Africa belongs to those who conquered it. Those who conquered it control the economy, own most of the land, and are in control of a particular and narrow, self-serving conception of the rule of law. They are not going to give those up. Not peacefully, in my view. Because what must kick in is the magnanimity of white people when it comes to the economy, to the question of land, and to this idea of what constitutes the rule of law. If that magnanimity does not kick in, something else will kick in. Violence will kick in. Now, this violence I'm talking about, which will be born out of the poor social and economic conditions of underdevelopment of those who are oppressed during colonialism and apartheid, is violence that is independent from any violent intent, if there is such a thing, on the part of MK. Now, a lot of the narrative is constituted by what I call political miseducation. Our politicians and sections of our media have been quite generous in sharing their political miseducation with us.
It's true, and you mentioned this hypocrisy around the Constitution, which is another thing I think we have to touch on. We're already so unpopular, we might as well go even further, Gogo. But actually, we're not unpopular. It turns out we're one of the most popular conversation places in South Africa. So it's interesting that
Our detractors will say we're popular with the wrong people.
indeed, indeed. We're not popular with the markets.
Yes.
The Constitution has featured prominently in the public debate in this election. I had two really interesting conversations, one with Dr. Ndando Sindane and one with Prof. Pierre de Vos. Now, here's what I don't understand. When is it okay to call for a change to the Constitution? Because I read again comments of Helen Zille, who I'm taking very seriously, who said the first thing that the coalition is going to do is change the Constitution because this 14 days thing doesn't work.
Yeah.
So they wish, or at least there's a view, that they should move a constitutional amendment because the 14 days is too short. But this is the constitutionalist camp that treats the Constitution as sacrosanct, but changing it is the first thing they want to do.
Yeah.
Again, Ronaldohos and the extremist racist language, which is built on a deeper denial of the evil of apartheid, but also a refusal to ever accept that there can be state intervention for racial justice in the economy, in admissions, through affirmative action, through broad-based Black economic empowerment, simply unconstitutional. Yet, that's never seen as extremist or dangerous or unconstitutional. In fact, the Constitution is used as a mask to protect that agenda. So then MK, I'm going to say indelicately for sure, says we want to scrap the Constitution.
How dare they?
Yeah.
The best constitution in the world.
Which, by the way, is not at all what the EFF says. The EFF has a different perspective, which is particularly that, just like the Helen Zille says, we need to move an amendment of Section 25. Now, again, for some reason, the EFF is called anti-constitutionalist because they want to move an amendment. So I just don't get any sense of coherence about the ANC. Let's talk there. Is corruption constitutional? Is the theft of state resources constitutional? Is misgovernance constitutional? So I just don't get who gets to use the Constitution and who gets called an anti-constitutionalist when it seems to me that there is broad agreement on the Constitution. However, there are different versions of what should be changed and how far that change should go. And creating scarecrows about people who want to throw away the Constitution when what they want to do is move one amendment or move significant amendments through the parliamentary process. I don't think MK has ever said they don't want to do it
exactly.
through the appropriate channels. they get called anti-constitutionalists, and yet those who also do unconstitutional things are called constitutionalists. I'm confused.
I'm not surprised. So those arguments you have alluded to are not being made innocently. They are made with a hidden agenda behind them. For instance, yes, amend the Constitution when it comes to things that matter to us as the DA. Do not amend the Constitution when it comes to things that matter to the majority, particularly the Black majority. So whether you agree with MK or not, some of the points they're raising need to be discussed, such as the question of Roman Dutch law. This idea that the rule of law is a lump of clay, and there's only one lens through which we must see or read the rule of law is problematic. So we need to have a discussion about the rule of law and avoid a situation where a particular idea or conception of the rule of law is imposed on everyone. So MK is not wrong to raise the question of Roman Dutch law. They are not wrong to ask for the scrapping of the Constitution. Up to the point where they argue that we must scrap the Constitution, they're not wrong. Beyond that, they might become wrong when it comes to the means by which they say this must happen. But up to the point, they simply make the argument that it must be scrapped. We must have that debate. My own view is that the Constitution must be rewritten. Because in the first place, any constitution, anywhere in the world, including ours, represents the triumph of a particular worldview over others. So this constitution represents the triumph of a particular worldview over others. So MK is correct to ask for a conversation about whether we should scrap the Constitution or not. In my view, we must rewrite it.
And there's nothing unconstitutional about using the constitutional means and parliamentary means to change the Constitution. However far you want to go, we can talk about the practicalities.
Yeah.
Because you would need 75%
Yeah.
to change the whole Constitution. But I don't see why that debate should be stifled under the guise of...
It's stifled because of this hidden agenda. There's another way of explaining the hidden agenda. You remember the basic structure doctrine. You remember the seminal case in the India, was it the Indian Supreme Court?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Which came with this idea of a basic structure doctrine.
Yeah.
Which, of course, does not originate in India. It originates in Germany. The idea that there are certain things in the Constitution that are beyond the power of amendment. That's what the basic structure doctrine is about.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do here, the hidden agenda, is to impose a particular version of the basic structure doctrine. In other words, what is in that Constitution and the Constitution must eternally remain immutable. That's the version of the basic structure doctrine this agenda is trying to impose.
My position is slightly different, but I think I fully accept that this conversation is necessary and needed. And if there's going to be anything like a national dialogue, which I must also get your views on, then we must put these questions on the table without any fear and have the real debate rather than the superficial one. I do think that there is a way in which the Constitution narrates South Africa's history, particularly in its opening sections, the preamble, which skirts over.
By the way, is apartheid mentioned in our constitution?
No,
Is that the word used?
it's not used at all. It's not used at all. All we get told is that there are, quote, injustices of the past. Exactly what those injustices are, we don't know. That there's a lot of focus on dignity and equality and freedom and very little focus on justice and reparation.
Not to belabor the question. The word colonialism, does it feature in our constitution?
I don't believe colonialism features either. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And I don't see what the nation loses when we say the starting point is the horror evil of colonialism and apartheid. And we want to create a society that is the opposite of that horror.
My own view, if you cannot name it, you will not change it.
I think that's such a fundamental point. Do we name what we're actually trying to change, or do we exist in vagaries that anyone can latch onto? Which, by the way, is exactly why the Freedom Front Plus also says that we must protect the Constitution and the DA and the ANC and sometimes the EFF and even indeed MK sometimes. And I do think we really need to have a conversation about that. You know, I don't think the Constitution can be interpreted out of that omission. On the other hand, I do think that, you know, the Constitution has done really important work, not just obviously in securing the right to vote, which is the start, which it does, but guaranteeing the right to life, political association, freedom of expression, which we're currently exercising to its limits.
Yes. We're pushing the envelope.
Indeed. Political rights, I think all of that is good. There's probably even something good, even though it doesn't go far enough in the socioeconomic rights. So I think there's a lot that one would preserve, or that I would at least preserve, but there's also a lot that I would want to change. And I don't see why it's this untouchable conversation to talk about even those founding values and how they might contribute to our current inequality. But then there's another conversation, which is about the design of the state, which is really what the Constitution is about. You know, when you get past Chapter 2, the provinces, the spheres of government, Parliament's powers, the president's powers, and I think that should all be up for at least national conversation in this moment. Or we can just ignore the 25% of the electorate that is saying this to us, pretend that everything is fine, and allow the inequalities that we see to fester.
Well, the national dialogue, I see now the president has jumped on that bandwagon of the national dialogue, formally so, in his speech yesterday.
I think it's going to be their big signature move.
Yeah. And if my memory serves me well, Chile has just rewritten its constitution. If my memory serves me well. It took them a number of years. A process we would call a national dialogue about what should go into the new constitution. If a national dialogue is going to be about a 3-day conference where the elites meet, quaff single malt 16-year-old whiskey and smoke cigars, it will take us to a point worse than where we are today.
Absolutely.
So for me, a national dialogue is necessary, but looking at it from the perspective of the ANC must have its own dialogue. And there has been a call for the ANC to host a dialogue, not only with current members of the party, but also with former members of the party. Of course, I'm angling for an invitation, as you can see.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, they should invite you.
And allies, class and otherwise, should be part of that internal, much broader conversation of the ANC. And some of the ideas that come out of that then feed into the national dialogue. So today we end up with an elite pact, the GNU. For me, it's also an urban pact, by the way. It's a pact of the urban bourgeoisie to a large extent. So we must avoid what we have done in the past, where the elites lock themselves in salubrious accommodation, as I said, quaffing single malt, 16-year-old whiskey and smoking cigars, and pretend that they and the so-called chartering classes represent national sentiment. If it's going to be a national dialogue, it must be truly national. It must not be about the elites attempting to impose an elite pact on the rest of society.
So true. I fully agree. And this is why I'm in the same boat. I'm skeptical about a national dialogue. I will participate from a position of skepticism. Because
you are not going to be invited.
Oh well.
Tell you now.
If I'm not invited, I'll have the national dialogue right here with my 100,000 subscribers.
But we may be lucky.
Yeah.
You remember the former Grahamstown Art Festival?
Yes.
There was a fringe festival. So there may be a fringe national dialogue to which you and I
will be the main speakers, actually.
Yes.
And, I think I'm always open to the prospect of dialogue in its true sense.
Yeah.
And I'm always open, and this is part of the reason why this channel even exists. It's to give South Africans a different perspective. It may not always be the right perspective, but it is a different perspective to the one they will normally hear. And they can make of that perspective what they want, but at least they've heard it. But the reason I'm skeptical is exactly for two reasons that you raised. Number one, if we're going to have a national dialogue, then we can't start the agenda by leaving the very items that are most important for the dialogue off the table. So, for example, we can't say we're having a national dialogue, but we're not going to talk about the Constitution, because that's exactly what we need to have a national dialogue about. And that should be the end product of a new national dialogue, should be a new national constitution. Not the MK's constitution or the EFF's or the DA's or the ANC's, but the people's constitution. So if we're going to have a national dialogue and we're not going to talk about racial injustice and land dispossession and the condition of the black majority and how the ANC has become complicit in that condition, then it's not a national dialogue. It's a national PR exercise.
Yes, exactly. PR and marketing.
Yeah. So if we really want a national dialogue, are we prepared for that dialogue? And I don't know that we are.
Can we close with a question from me to you this time? I argued to you last time that whatever arrangement we end up with, of course we have ended up with this government of national unity. I argued that whatever arrangement we end up with, it will not erase our reality, that our post-apartheid reality is a neo-apartheid reality. In your book, you characterize our reality as neo-apartheid. I have my reasons. What are yours?
It's all around us. It's everything that's not marketed to us as the success. It's sprawling townships which have townships within those townships, the impunity with which racism continues not just to exist, but actually to be a commercially successful enterprise, the power of private capital over people's wishes. We see the effects every day, but we refuse to acknowledge it. It's that which we see that is unspoken, which I think defines our society.
If you don't mind, Ruby, may I end on a polite note? On the point you've just made on the power of private capital, don't forget that when money talks, people mumble.
Absolutely.
When money talks, politicians mumble even more.
Can I ask you one more question, Gogo, if I may?
Yes.
Which is about the cabinet itself, because we're in this moment of President Ramaphosa now having to actually figure this cabinet out. It took him about 7 days last time because there was so much just the internal ANC politics was enough to make it last a week. We're already in a lot of dispute. What are the things that are top of your mind when we think about what this new cabinet might look like and what the coalition government will have to be grappling with? And what are the trade-offs that you see that may have to be made?
Well, we must not forget that the appointment of cabinet is a political act. Because it is a political act, it is influenced in part by what I call politics in the shadows. So one of the things that are going to influence the decision the president makes about who is appointed to cabinet is about the fact that political communication, amongst other things, has two dimensions, the public and the hidden. Many things that happen in the lives of society are things that are hidden, are things that are shaped by that which is hidden, not the public dimension of political communication. So the considerations that will inform what the president decides, in part, will be based on that which is hidden, what I call politics in the shadows. But there are certain positions I'm interested in. For instance, does the DA get the position of deputy president? If it does, what happens to Paul Mashatile? Does that give him enough time and opportunity to mobilize against the president? Because if the DA gets the deputy president, then his case will be that of so near and yet so far. Does the DA get finance? Do they even want finance? They got finance in KZN. Do they want foreign affairs? Do they want public enterprises? Let me tell you what my worry, though, is. Whatever the specificities of the individual cabinet appointments are, there's a reality we are going to contend with. There is going to be some kind of re-engineering of cabinet, the government, and the state. There is going to be an element of reconfiguration, which means for some years before we go to the 2029 elections, we will have to contend with the fact that the state will not be able to perform optimally because it will be in the process of reconfiguring itself while it is expected to perform optimally. The question for me is, whatever cabinet appointments the president makes, what will the GNU put in place to manage this conundrum of a state that must deliver optimally while it is in the process of re-engineering and reconfiguring itself?
That's such an important point because the virtue that we are being told of this government is that it will be able to deliver.
Yes.
We may not like all its elements, but at least the lights will stay on and the
Yes.
potholes will be fixed and there will be, quote, stability and governance. If the government cannot deliver even that, which will be hard, it will be hard to see how the GNU, so-called, will actually survive very long.
Yeah. But where if there's a breakup, one of the reasons some elements of the GNU will want to leave, there's a point before the next election at which they must time their departure carefully to avoid a situation where they are blamed for the failures of the GNU. If the different parties leave that decision too late, what will happen is in the 2026, 2029 elections, they get blamed for the failures of the GNU. So one of the motivations for leaving the GNU by those who will decide to leave it will be to make sure that the blame is put on those who remain at the time of the next election.
And just finally on this cabinet question, Gogo, I actually think the cabinet announcement is going to be one of the most important moments in this whole story, because so far the ANC has managed, and to its great credit, I must say, if there's one thing President Ramaphosa can do, he knows how to negotiate a deal for power.
Yes.
He's been at the center of ANC deals for power and national deals for power, and he's done it again. But at some point, the ANC is going to lose power somewhere. They've managed to hold on to the presidency, cling on to the speaker. They're in coalition in places. They've kept Gauteng. At some point, power is going to slip from their grasp. And that is probably going to be the moment. I think it's going to be in cabinet when they have to give up a lot of positions there, that they finally realize the true effect of this election.
Well, one of the things that's going to hit the members of the GNU is the realization that power always exists in counterpoint to powerlessness. If they find themselves on the wrong side of that, they will find themselves with much less power than they desired. So one of the things the different components of the GNU, the ANC, the DA, the IFP, and so on, must manage is the balance between power and powerlessness, to the extent that power always exists in counterpoint to powerlessness. They must manage that balance in such a way that they don't find themselves on the wrong side of that equation.
Gogo, thank you so much for joining us for this extended and fascinating conversation on SMWX. Really appreciate your time and your insights for this trilogy of pre- and post-election conversations.
Tamako, Magwandi.
Thank you for watching SMWX. Like, share, subscribe, and make sure that you spread the fire. What does that mean? That you spread this channel by word of mouth and help us get from 100 to 200,000 subscribers. That's the next milestone. Thanks so much, fam, for joining us. It's always great to have you. And stay locked for the next episode of SMWX. Aye.